For our next speaker, he's usually one who shares about something at the meta level and also imparting his wealth of knowledge to us. So something to note is usually his slides has quite background for everything. And probably this coming one is going to be white as well. So this past few months has kept us in mostly confined within our rooms, but many events are still happening. So what are those events that our next speaker recommends and should watch? So let's welcome our next speaker to share more about it. Please welcome Tan Li Hao. Li Hao, please.
Whoops. Can you check whether everything is okay?
Yep, it's good.
Okay. So, hi guys. It's been a while since I spoke, so it's a bit nervous over here. But yeah, so I'll be covering about what has happened for the past few weeks in React. I think we used to have this section in RK where we share about like what happened this week in React, or maybe but this we haven't been doing that for quite a while. So I don't know. I feel like we haven't been doing it since the COVID. So I was just gonna collate everything I can find since February. So a little bit of myself first. So for those who don't know me, I'm Li Hao. If you are in a company, you want to find me, you can find me on MetaMost by this handle. If on Twitter, you can find with a different handle, and GitHub with another different handle. So naming is hard. It's too late for me to change all of them. But yeah, I guess it's a bad consistency over here. But hey, now you know where to find me. So let's talk about React. So what has happened? I think since February, the only releases that I found on React was 16.13. I think the only one interesting so if you go into it and you read, there's like all the things about it. But I find one in particularly interesting, which is, hold on, how come I can't scroll? Okay, yeah. So the one that I find particularly interesting is, I don't know, I find it particularly interesting is this one. So if you look at this JSX, if you set toggle to be true, then you have this style. If it's false, it will be this one. So you'll be kind of expect that if it's toggling on and off, it should be still showing red background color, but it's actually not. Interestingly, if you are true initially, you are seeing red, which is correct. But if you toggle it to be false, because of diffing or something happened in React, I didn't really know. It feels like it wants to remove the background because background property is removed in the style, so the background actually turns into transparent. And if you toggle it on back again, it actually sets the background style to the attribute to the style, and then actually the background turns into blue. So this was like pretty interesting, like some edge cases that you would never thought about it, but apparently they fix it lah. So it just find it interesting that there's just like many different ways that you can break React, and this is one of those that I find it interesting. So let's come back to this one. I think so you can read all the fixes and minor features that was added. You can read it on your own. So the next thing I want to share about is React Native. React Native is like I think React Knowledgeable is not just about React; it's also about React Native. I find it's like least covered things about in RK. Hopefully, more people will share about our React Native. So what happened also React Native is that they have a new version release as well. So for this one, they released with Flipper. So I think for those who don't know about Flipper, I also don't know. I just researched it yesterday. I think it's like a dev tools that was developed for React Native by the Facebook. So there's a React Europe talk about it. I think it was last week. I can't remember. right? So that was something that was, yeah, so that's about it. And then I think one thing that is more interesting was that I think it was just this week or last week where, I think end of last year, Windows was like starting to work of React Native for Windows. So you can build Windows native app with React Native. And now they just announced that you can do it for Mac OS too. So basically, if you're writing React Native, you can target your application to uh, Android, iOS, Windows, Surface Windows, as well as Mac OS, which is pretty cool and interesting. So next thing I want to cover is actually about Next.js. So yeah, I find Next.js is is something very interesting to me because you know we in Shopee we started our project way earlier. I think way earlier before Next.js was there. We started SSR very early as well. So basically, we are not using Next.js in Shopee. We built a lot of our custom thing. So Next.js is like a service. It has like it's an opinionated framework. It contains like how you should do your routing, you should do server-side rendering, and a lot of different things. So Next.js to me, right, is like a treasure where it contains a lot of different goodies that how you can um, make your React project better. For example, right now we are not using Next.js, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't follow or learn about Next.js because, for example, in this Next.js, like I think recently they added fast refresh. So what is fast refresh? How do you configure fast refresh in your React project if you're not using React.js? Then this is very interesting where you can just basically go into Next.js and look at the commit that added that fast refresh and you just copy that over to your repository. So there's a lot of different features that was added. Uh, I think this is not the exhaustive list. These are the one that I find it interesting. So static site generation is the one that we do server side. So I think right now in front end world um, you do client side rendering and then you do like a server side rendering, like you pre-render something and then you send it to the client, but you render that on demand, on request. Static site generation is actually you render it on build time, right? So what they do is that you can actually, uh, uh, I think you have to click into it. I think you can provide some options to tell Next.js that how you can, like they provide static props and static paths and some of those things that allows you to create static pages alongside with also dynamic pages. So it's like a hybrid strategy of both. So for example, if you're building like a, a Shopee a website, right? So you know that some pages are maybe static, right? Maybe some of the event landing page is static. So these are the things that you can play with to do that. And then some of the pages you can't do that because they have to dynamic render. So Next.js allows you to do both at the same time, depending on what kind of props you provide. So that was pretty interesting. I hope that we can do something like that as well. I think like there's a lot of ways to improve and optimize on our Shopee site. And I guess they also integrated, Web Vitals is like Google right now is pushing Lighthouse as Web Vitals, something I can't remember. Like they rebranded it to Web Vitals and it's very important. And then um, they're integrating it to the build system. So I think recently also Next.js, during last year's Google I/O, Google was announced that they work with Next.js team to add a lot of improving on the Next.js performance of the Next.js app, right? So there's a lot of commits that was happening, and those are very interesting things that you can learn on how you can improve your optimize your React project, right? Okay, so next one is create React app. So create React app to me is also similar to Next.js. Like it's like a more, it's somewhere you can look out to learn how to configure React if you are doing it your own, if you're not using a create React app. It teaches me like how to do a I think there's one example that what we did was like we do a error overlay that was from Create React app initially, and then we just copied over, and then now we have like error overlay in development mode. But I was looking at what has happened in Create React app over the past months. Nothing interesting happened, so I think mostly are fixes and adding configurations. So nothing much to share over there. So the next thing is React status. So for those who don't know about React status, React status is a weekly newsletter of React. It contain like every week they will send you an email about what are the things that are interesting about React, right? So actually I just so to talk about what are interesting about React, I went through my email and then read out all the newsletter that was sent to me. Uh, Honestly, I didn't really read it every week, but I did it yesterday to read all the I think 4 months time, 4 weeks of newsletter to find out like what are interesting things that has happened. And really, there's a lot of things that I find it interesting. So it's like quite a long list about it. So React libraries in 2020. So similar to the reason I find it interesting in Next.js and Create React is that it teaches you how to configure your React app, right? If you're not using Next.js or Create React app. React libraries is another way where it teaches you how to, how to create a component. That you can learn a lot of things from the popular React libraries on how they create, say, a button component or maybe a pop-up. React router, so there's a lot of libraries updates. Which one I find it interesting is that, I guess I'll just cover some of the things that I find it interesting. Downshift is pretty interesting. So downshift, if you look at the API of downshift, um, downshift is like a library that help you to create a autocomplete or a combo box component, but itself doesn't contain any UI in it. So basically how you use it is you can use a render props or use a hooks of downshift, and then but with itself it contains all the logic that you need for a combo box, and then you render that out. You render your combo box based on whatever style you want. So it doesn't have opinion or it doesn't care about the view. It just focus on the logic itself only. So that's a pretty interesting way of uh, designing an API for a component. React Native Dev, if you don't know, Facebook's React Native URL was used to be facebook.github.io/React Native. So now they have a new domain name called reactnative.dev. What else? It's interesting. Yeah, let me see. Oh, React Beautiful drag and drop. This one is pretty amazing as well. If you see, I don't have a demo, but if you go for a demo, you'll find that they they did a very good accessibility for drag and drop. Maybe I just show you a screenshot. So if you like, if your keyboard you tap to the item that you want to drag and drop, you can use your keyboard to drag and drop. And when you are selecting on that item, it will tell you that you have like he will tell you that you have lifted that task. If you want to drag and drop, it will ask you to move your keyboard up and down. Like it's a well thought out accessibility for drag and drop. Something interesting to look at. Redwood.js is something I want to point out. So for those who don't know, this is another framework. You can think of it as like kind of counterpart of Next.js. So it's that Next.js kind of framework where it covers front end, back end, and everything. It has opinions on how you should use React, GraphQL, and even like all the way to the database. So one thing interesting about Redwood, right, is, hold on, Red, I don't have the, oh wait, I think my link, So one thing interesting about Redwood is, well, okay, cookbook. Sorry, I forgot to include the link. So one thing interesting is the cells. So so one thing interesting is that Redwood prefers what we call convention over configuration. So if you look at this, a cell, right, is like a component, but instead of export like a default component or export something, it has a convention where you can export cons of a query, loading, empty, failure, and success. And by doing so, so the name is based on convention only, right? There's no rules, right? So you have to name it like the same way. And if you do it this way, it will handle, loading this query, and while querying, you will show the loading component. While it's empty, you will show the empty component, and it handles all the logic for you. Like it can. So doing this way, it has more opportunities to optimize, where do a refetch or retry or maybe caching. Everything is being done by the framework, so you just fill in the blanks where when to show loading and what to show when there's content. So that's something to think about. Then I think over here I have 2 pages of React status. Like 4 months of React status is a lot. Over here, I think the one that is interesting is I think profiling React.js performance. If you never did it before, this article is well written. It's written by Eddie Osmani. So he's an engineering manager for Google Chrome. So he focuses more on like performance thing, and so basically it teach you how to do profiling for React. I guess another one would be interesting food for thought would be like second guessing the modern web. So this article was written by Tom McWright. He's the one that founded Mapbox, and also he worked a lot on D3 and Mapbox and OpenStreetMap. So he wrote this article, like he was thinking like, are we doing the right thing? Like, like server side rendering, and then you do a hydration. Like we are like building a lot of, making it more and more complex just to make it optimized. Like, is this the right way we are going? So there was his article, and then in in reply, I think like Rich Harris, or creator of Svelte, I think he wrote in defense of the modern web to reply and to point out his point of view. So I don't want to spoil you guys. So you guys, if you guys are interested in, you should go for it, right? Yeah. So React podcast. So besides newsletter, there's a lot of things that you can learn about React without going to like social media, or I don't know, like Twitter is like the social media for technology right now, or you go for like Reddit and those kind of things. But if you are lazy to do those, I think React status, the newsletter, and React podcast, a podcast, is good enough to know all the in things about React. So so React podcasts over here. Uh, yeah, I basically, these are almost all the episodes that was done since February. So they have one podcast every week. All of them are amazing. So the most recent one is by Pete Hunt. If you don't know him, he's like one of those founding, like one of the creator of React, right? He and so like in 2013, where uh, Jordan Walk announced like React in ReactConf US, and then people were actually, so in the podcast they discuss about like what happened over there, right? So you get some candid conversations and interviews during the podcast. So he was sharing like everyone immediately dislike about React, about having to write JSX. They don't think this is a good idea. They think it's bad, and and how he feel that way, like how they slowly go and educate or explain, or to understand why people don't like it. And then he had this amazing, I just learned about it yesterday, recently also, because I didn't know that. So he, after I think 4 months after the announcement in React Conf US, Pete Hunt went to React Conf EU and then did another conference talk about rethinking about best practices in React. So I think that is very amazing talk. Like you imagine yourself where there's no React in this world and you don't believe, like, why would you want to write JSX? What is so good about JSX, or why should we use React? I think this is the one that I think is the game change, the one that convinced a lot of people to actually take a look at React, and then how the community started to pick up from there. That's what I learned from the podcast. So there's a lot of things that you can't really like read out from a blog or whatever. So I guess they don't have transcripts. So the only thing you can learn from this is from the React podcast. So that's, yeah. So if you're interested, there's a lot of amazing stuff. Like 85 is Michael Jackson, from the creator of React Router, talking about how he refactored React Router, how long he spent, and how frustrating it is to work on open source, things like that, right? So lastly, about conferences that was happening, um, this is, I'm not sure whether this is exhaustive list, but you know, any these are the things that was happening that I could found yesterday. If you ask me what is interesting, haven't really watched all of them, but by the title, so I only clicked into the title that I find it interesting. So for React Europe, I watched the three of these. Uh, those are amazing. Especially I think like the first one, reject. So the first one will be talking about how this guy is creating a web, just like how, uh, like, yeah, lessons learned while creating a very interesting app. And then the third one was also similar, in a similar tone, where he explained like how the problems he faced while working on Excalibur and how he solved them, and a lot of interesting concepts and ideas that come about. So I think that is all the things I have. Yeah, so I think I covered quite a lot of content. So things that I don't mention doesn't mean that they are not important or they're not interesting. It's just that yeah, you should go and read them, right? So yeah, that's all from me.
All right, thank you, Li Hao, for sharing your personal tastes for some of these things that we can look out for. So it seems like there is a whole lot of things that's still happening, even though we are still at home and then we're still practicing social distancing. I think there are no questions from the audience, but I think Michael would like to say that guys, please wash your hands. Um, yeah, so thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Li Hao, again for and Tenzi for sharing the two topics today. So that's all for today.